I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Franc Milburn, former intelligence officer, strategic risk analyst, and author of the Pentagon's UAP Task Force. He joins us to discuss the U.S. government's ATIP and UAPTF investigations and the potential risk and threat posed by unidentified aerial phenomenon. So Frank, welcome. Let's start out with the Pentagon's UAP Task Force paper that you authored. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what led you to publish this paper through the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Tim. I have a background in military intelligence and officer, military intelligence and counterintelligence, and I have a degree in international relations from the London School of Economics. Since leaving the military, I've got over 22 years of experience producing threat and risk assessments, which is pretty much what I was doing in the military, for clients, private sector clients. These clients operating mainly sort of hostile environments from North Africa to the Middle East, including sort of Iraq and also Latin America, and basically providing strategic and operational risk assessments of the prevailing threats and risks to their business environments. These are often for extractive industries, but also for a range of other sectors, including FTSE 100 and Fortune 500. And I've also carried out consulting work for aerospace and government clients.
Wonderful.
I started writing for sort of internationally sort of recognized think tanks on terrorism and Middle East issues, and this was really to kind of like it was really a reflection of the client work that I was doing, because I was doing a lot of report writing on sort of political risks, security risks, and what was going on in a particular country or region for the companies I was working for. So it was natural for me then to think, well, actually, I could write about it as well, because I've actually been there and I've done it. So that's what I started doing. I had a renewed interest in UAP in 2017. I mean, I'd always had a sort of lifelong interest in it, including from my military days, a lifelong interest in UAP, but I really started researching in earnest in kind of 2017. And then in 2019, I actually asked the Naval Postgraduate School if I could do a paper on UAP for them. And while the head of academics was very actually interested in UAP, and he was sharing anecdotes with me on UAP, he said to me, look, it's like such a toxic subject at the moment that I couldn't touch it at all, but I am sympathetic to your plight in trying to get something published. So then I went to the Begin-Sadat Center in sort of summer 2020, and they accepted. It's a world-ranked strategic studies think tank at Israel's largest teaching university. And what I wanted to do really was move the study of UAP into the mainstream of the academic world. The International Advisory Board of the university is pretty high speed as well. King's College, John Hopkins professors. So I'm basically trying to lever the door open there into the academic world of strategic studies, war studies, and national security studies. And really, what was fascinating was, for example, like Richard Dolan's work, the idea of a parallel occult history that wasn't being taught at leading universities. And so that's really what developed my interest. And that was kind of my key driver behind wanting to get this published.
Okay. Now, ostensibly, this paper is about the ATIP and the UAPTF programs investigating UAPs, but you also drew on a wide range of data related to UFOs to put this together. So while you were doing your research, I'm wondering, did your beliefs or opinions change about this phenomenon? And did you learn anything new that surprised you?
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question. In terms of beliefs, I kept an open mind going into it. I mean, years ago, I used to think in kind of sort of like silos, and in terms of like UFOs in one box, cryptids in another, ghosts and supernatural in another. But I was already kind of well over that, and then I started reading about Skinwalker a lot more, and then talking to John Alexander, and then I was like, well, is it one phenomenon manifesting itself, or is it many phenomena, and what is it, or are they? So that was kind of really fascinating. I think what surprised me was the level of serious academic interest from some of those that I referenced in the paper, like Michael Masters, the biological anthropological side, Paul Hill on the propulsion and aeronautics, being a former NASA engineer. What surprised me as well was kind of like the infighting over the physics of the phenomenon between certain kind of well-known physicists and scientists that I mentioned in the paper. Although, for example, Dr. Jack Sarfati and Eric Davis, they both, while disagreeing on the physics, they agreed that UAP could present a threat. And I was surprised as well that even between former military people, there was a divide between those who see the cover-up in terms of, and I think there is a cover-up, definitely been a cover-up in terms of hiding tech, sort of craft bodies and orchestrated by some kind of cabal, and those who see the cover-up in terms of, the government being embarrassed at what it doesn't know and maybe being frightened to admit what it does know. I was surprised very pleasantly about how nice people were, and how much time and attention they gave me and how much knowledge they imparted, so that was really, really nice. I learnt a hell of a lot more about the possibilities of weaponizing UAP, what Sarfati calls a T-cube tic-tac tech, and it was kind of surprising the level of thought that was already going into this, although perhaps maybe with my background I shouldn't have been surprised about it, because if you see these things whizzing around in the skies from the 1940s onwards in a big way, then you're going to want to have that technology yourself. I think the very interesting was Davis's interview with Alejandro Rojas, when he's talking about the threat of UAP and the incidents that occurred, the 38 defense intelligence research documents which are projecting the technology to 2050. And also what was very interesting when he talks about the test that couldn't be performed, that was during the Nimitz encounter, said because the F-18s were unarmed, it's about planning for potential eventualities. We have to worry about something more advanced that could be overwhelming our military technology. So we've got to be able to extrapolate to 2050 where our physics will be there. Will our engineering be there? Will our industrial manufacturing technology be there to produce tic-tac technology? The military needs, in Davis's words, to be looking at making the weapons, and that's why we have the 38 papers. That was very interesting and surprising. And also as well, the Davis email to Jack Sarfati in the paper, where he says, we, meaning Hal Puthoff and I, for the ORSAP, that's the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program, for those who don't know, ORSAP, were not tasked to explain the tic-tac or UAP propulsion and power physics plus their other attributes. Instead, we were tasked to extrapolate 2009-2010 engineering physics of a variety of technical topics that were published as 38 Defense Intelligence reference document reports to the year 2050 in order to determine whether American engineering physics can approach or approximate or not the observed characteristics and capabilities of tic-tacs, UAPs. And this is the fascinating bit that he says, in a scenario where tic-tacs, UAPs, might become a future threat to the US. Yeah? And then, intriguingly, when he continues, the ground rules and assumptions that were established for the 38 Defense Intelligence research documents reports allowed us to speculate when hard empirical data on tic-tac UAPs was unavailable. Then he says, you cannot ever definitively explain tic-tacs UAPs unless and until you actually have a craft in your lab to examine and measure it for the purpose of comparing it. And then he says, a speculation or hypothesis is no good in the absence of hard empirical data. And says the empirical data must not be limited to the F-18 FLIR video, surface warship data, and the pilot reports. So, I mean, that was all really, really fascinating and new stuff for me.
Wonderful. Well, so as I understand things now, the ATIP program dates back a few years. That's not new. But what's brought this issue into the limelight, I guess, what's made it newsworthy are the Navy UAP sightings, which were publicly confirmed last year by the Department of the Navy. So did you learn anything about the Navy encounters that the public isn't aware of? And what makes these so important, I guess, to understanding this phenomena, especially when the phenomena itself dates back decades?
Okay, yeah, let me start with the first question. I think firstly what makes the Navy sightings since 2004 so important is the level of verifiable data from the range of sensors, from the platforms, the outstanding credibility and professional technical expertise of the witnesses. And then also you've got the videos, the open source scientific analysis, like that from the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, which is from open source, but still very, very good. And then you've got the various statements by the DoD, the guidelines on UAP reporting issued to the Navy, the intense and serious mainstream media interest. These are all really important. All these factors making the various cases so much more accessible to researchers, to the wider public, and also probably to lawmakers for positive change. So I think these incidents have made the whole UAP issue a lot more accessible to people. And especially that's kind of fueled by social media and and the intense media interest.
Okay.
I think that the strategic and operational threat factors pushed by TTSA towards briefing senators, and the announcement of UAPTF and the report mandated by Congress. Okay, those make these sightings significant as well. But I think it's also just important, not to forget that UAP studies or UFO studies, they didn't start in 2004, right? And there's a long and rich history of sightings and data which precede the modern period, going back like 7 decades. So that's why I think that it's important. In terms of what was new, I think the Eric Davis email to Sarfati and myself and others, when he says, I was a DOD deputized advisor, the Nimitz and Roosevelt investigator under a subcontract to the DOD. So I speculated on that, was Davis's comment. So he's saying he's a DOD deputized advisor to the Nimitz and Roosevelt investigator. So this is, if this is pre-ORSAP days and pre-ATIP days, i.e. pre-2007, then what was the name of the program and which part of the DOD was running it? So it was the Navy, was it the Army, was it the Air Force, was it the DIA? And why were Air Force officers taking advantage of taking custody of hard drives from the Nimitz Group ships and aircraft? And I asked the question, was Davis privy to a 2004 pre-ATIP Air Force investigation? So if the Air Force was the lead in this case, then it was likely that the Air Force Office of Special Investigations would be the lead agency involved. And from that, interestingly, there have been some more recent news coverage from Mystery Wire and Vice in April 2020 about the Air Force Office of Special Investigations investigating the release of the UAP videos. And Elizondo at the time, he says, well, I find it strange that the Pentagon would assign an Air Force unit to investigate alleged data spills involving Navy information, technology and data. And he said, especially where there's NCIS personnel present in the same building. Mystery Wire said, according to them, Elizondo is not clear why the Air Force Office of Special Investigations was chosen for this task. But it's quite interesting. It's quite interesting. And then also, what's fascinating is Davis talking about the Tic Tac episode and debunking Mike Turber, who's a former US Air Force intelligence analyst. So he claims that to this day that the Tic Tac seen by Fravor and others was a balloon, and the UAP caught on video is really an F-18. And then Davis basically comes down and says, look, the FLIR videos are not hoax. I perfectly know the provenance of those videos, plus all the associated Aegis weapon system and other radar, as well as all the pilot reports. These are the facts and are true. And he says this squeamish little nonsense about being skeptical and considering alternative narratives as a valid hypothesis is a sign of cognitive dissonance. So that was fascinating. And then he goes, Mike has no mathematics nor access to the original Navy data. He wasn't part of the ATIP, ORSAP, or Office of Naval Investigations. So that's, the Office of Naval Intelligence Investigations. So he's just putting out a full story for whatever reason. So was it the Office of Naval Intelligence investigating the Tic Tac incident alongside the Air Force Office of Special Investigations? If so, then why immediately hand over the hard drives to Air Force officers? Surely, if this was a Navy investigation and they already had chain of custody, you would expect the ONI to take the lead and then make the data available to the Air Force rather than immediately handing everything over, which would indicate that the Air Force were leading the investigation. And then the other fantastic and really interesting thing he says is, these craft are off-world, as I've told two Senate committees. That's my response a minute ago. It's not my opinion, but it's where the physics and the facts lead. And the last really, really interesting bit, I think, from the paper, and which a lot of people didn't pick up on, was when Davis says, I have no UFO propulsion physics projects to be funded because my new employer doesn't fund that type of research topic. I know that a few US government personnel already know who you are. He's talking to Sarfati and what you're about, but exotic or UFO propulsion physics research is not in their portfolio. Actual research falls under the purview of the military service labs and the Department of Energy labs. Your UFO propulsion idea will have to stand up to scrutiny by the Defense Science, Military Service Labs and the DOE Labs review boards and panels. So are they doing actual research? So are they just interested in UFO propulsion and physics, or are they actually researching them? Yeah, so I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so now despite the recent public interest in the Navy sightings, again, this subject is over 70 years old, perhaps much longer, and there have been thousands of sightings reported. So does any of the historical data on this apply to the current study of this phenomena? And how can we separate truth from mythology in this area?
Okay, yeah, it's a good questions.
Yeah.
Data application to the current study. Yeah, as I said before, it's important not to let the kind of post 2004, or as some people call it, modern UFO period dominate. There's plenty of compelling cases from the past 70 years with outstanding witnesses, and also sometimes with documentation to back them up, like the 1976 Tehran case and a DIA report that was copied all the way to the White House. At the same time, while there's a lot of case and data, military and civil cases, there hasn't been a lot of progression in terms of who or what the intelligences behind the various phenomena are, right? So it might be there's some understanding on the part of a very small, very select group in a DOE program or some DOD USAP. But I ask, with all the aerospace industry consolidation over the years, how do you keep the secret? Transaction due diligence, people leaving companies, business units being absorbed into other companies, reporting to shareholders, not to mention people within the DOD, the DOE, and intelligence community stakeholders. Very, very hard to keep those kind of things secret. I think overall the impression that I get is that the UFO problem for the military and intelligence community, and I'd say in the US and the UK, it's basically it's a bit of a cliche, but it's a can that's been kicked down the road or simply thrown in the rubbish bin, maybe, because the DOD and the intelligence community didn't likely know how to deal with it. So, as I mentioned in the paper, there's been a lot of reinventing of the wheel. We know the US government was still very interested in the late 1970s from the Iran case. As I mentioned, that the DIA report that was copied into the White House, John Alexander's Advanced Theoretical Physics program, and and various UFO cases. And I got contacted by one aerospace engineer, and he kind of hit the nail on the head. He said, well, we've been looking into this so-called problem since the outbreak of World War II and our initial entry into the nuclear physics era. So what have we gained looking at the same thing, the same way over and over? So he said there's a lot of finger pointing but little true analysis. Emphasis is how this impacts us from a security standpoint. And then interestingly, he says maybe that's the problem. In terms of separating truth from mythology, yeah, there's a lot of mythology. I think follow the facts and use critical thinking skills. I mean, there's a lot of, I'd say things that a lot of so-called mythologies out there that could be rectified if people actually engage their kind of thought process. And some of the things that you listen to are really kind of quite out there. So I think using critical thinking skills.
Yeah. Well, so now your report is a very detailed analysis of the UAP phenomena. That's one of the things that I loved about it. That's one of the reasons that I wanted to interview you, is you have drilled down to an incredible extent, and you've tried to really use as objective information as you were able to find on this. And you've also cited dozens of scientific and military authorities on UAPs. So after reading this report carefully, my takeaway is that UAPs are intelligently controlled machines, not from Earth. That was my takeaway, was that these are ET of some kind, or something that is not created by a foreign government, I guess. So the military doesn't seem to be saying this outright, but are we talking about extraterrestrials?
Well, Eric Davis uses off-world. He doesn't specifically say ET. The DOD has said unidentified. Yeah. He was, in his own words, a DOD advisor, so people can draw their own conclusions. Looking back to his NIDS days, the National Institute for Discovery Science of Bob Bigelow, if you look at his NIDS day and John Alexander's experiences and comments from there, there's a range of possibilities as outlined in the paper. So, time traveler, interdimensional, extraterrestrial, precognitive sentient phenomena. In the April 2019 interview with Alejandro Rojas, which is really excellent, Davis says, well, we know one thing, we know they're there. We don't know their origin because they don't want to communicate that to us, yeah? And if you look at Elizondo, he's posited a range of possibilities as well. He said, basically ATIP has had the required clearances regarding the origin. The issue was no one actually knew the answer. And then he says, let's not confuse the term extraterrestrial with interdimensional, superterrestrial, and ultraterrestrial. He says there's lots of other options apart from simply them aliens out there. John Alexander was kind of interesting on it as well, because he said to me in a in an email, like, your question about spatial, temporal, or dimensional in origin. Answer is both yes and I don't know, which is probably a good answer. All of the above are possible. In my opinion, there does appear to be a consciousness component. However, that does not mean that some interactions don't take place in physical reality. And then he, goes on to say, well, the topic's terribly complex and possibly beyond our human capability to imagine it. But he does say then, I think we should try and, given the minuscule resources that have been allocated, I don't see any breakthroughs soon. So that was a good point. David Mahler, in his work on triangle UFOs, which I really, really liked, and obviously so that's why I put it in the paper, and which was forwarded by Colonel John Alexander, he concludes, right, these craft are of unknown origin. We appear to be confronted with something other than human technology. Therefore, the implications are profound. Objects may be spatial, temporal, or dimensional in origin. If you talk to Michael Masters, from the professor of biological anthropology, and he also looks at hominid evolutionary anatomy, modern human variation, archaeology, and biomedicine. So in his book, Identified Flying Objects, he's theorizing that these aliens, rather than being ET or from a distant solar system, are simply us from the future, or not simply, but are us from the future, from a different time in the distant future. And then Professor Paul Hill, the NASA aerospace engineer, that I had in the section under old school UFO weapons theories, he's quoted as saying, well, being knowledgeable of US government secrets on propulsion, I've known from the start that UFOs could not possibly be of Earth technology manufacture.
Yeah. Well, so I'd like to switch gears just a little bit and ask about the threat potential of UAPs, because this is something that you've written about extensively. And again, you're one of the few people who has tried to take a serious and objective look at this, which is why I wanted to interview you. So can you tell me about the potential threat to strategic assets and carrier strike groups, along with, aviation accident risks posed by near collisions and electromagnetic effects of UAPs? What kind of threat are we looking at here, just on the most basic level of maybe even the Navy UAPs?
Yeah, certainly. There's the floated around kind of equation, if you call it that. Threat is capability plus intent. So people say they're not a threat, they are a threat, they want to help us, they want to infiltrate us. If you're David Jacobs, well, who are they? Without knowing that, the answer to that question, i.e. who they are, you can't assign an intent. If you're looking at, the Russians, the Chinese, North Korea, Iran, you can assign intentions based on observation, as well as on, historical behavior, and also as well as their stated intentions. You are able to assign intent. So it's impossible to identify intent without knowing who they are, and there's so many different types of craft. This is just my view. There's so many different types of craft, and such a great variation in descriptions of the occupants. So this, to me, would indicate that there's lots of different groups of others, and quite possibly with differing agendas. And I don't think this is anything new. Lots of people have expounded this. So saying they intend to do this or they intend to do that, that needs qualification in each instance. Who are they? I think Elizondo, and I'll be completely upfront with this, I agree with what he's saying in this particular statement. He says everything's a potential threat until one is sure that it's not a threat. When you look at it from an intelligence perspective, they have a key interest in our nuclear capabilities, military capabilities overall, specifically in nuclear capabilities. If we don't know who they are, we don't know how the technology works, we don't know what their intentions are, but they're operating with impunity in our airspace and sea space, then he says, well, it's a safe bet to say that with this level of technological capability, that they could be a threat if they wanted to be one. And I agree with that. And I also agree when he says anyone who says for sure that they're not a threat, they don't know what they're talking about. And I'll say that's true. If you look at that really interesting interview with Commander David Fravor's wingman, interviewed and unidentified, she comments on basically on the intercept that they made. She goes, it was so unnerving because it was so unpredictable. High G, rapid velocity, rapid acceleration. So you're wondering, how can I possibly fight this? So she uses the word unnerved. She's a highly trained fighter pilot, flying with one of the Navy's most experienced leaders, and she's in one of the most technically advanced. Well, she's in the most technically advanced military in the world. So she obviously saw it as a potential threat. But yet, people who weren't there or don't have her training or Fravor's experience somehow think that UAP could not possibly be a threat. And personally, I'll go with the expert witnesses who were there on the scene. That's just me. At Elizondo, there's been some very interesting statements which not a lot of people, to my knowledge, have actually picked up on, but I've extracted them. And he says in a Military Matters podcast from Stars and Stripes, he says these are the key things. He goes, there are patterns we've recognized what UAP are interested in, which are not different from what adversaries are interested in. So obviously the implication is there is if the Russians or the Chinese were looking at our strategic facilities, we would be highly concerned about it. So why would we not be concerned about it if UAP are doing it? Then he says the methodologies that these UAP use to conduct their operations is very similar to the way we ourselves would conduct some sort of reconnaissance mission. Yeah, he said that to Exo magazine. So, that's pretty worrying.
Yeah.
Then he says, and then this is even more interesting. He goes, unfortunately, we're getting into some specifics about potential capabilities. I can't answer that. I can very easily go down a road here that will get me into trouble. So they've been looking, obviously, as a threat, and in terms of the potential capabilities.
Well, so now, along with these indirect threats that I mentioned before, which are basically negligence, right? You've talked about a more direct threat. Some of this goes back to kind of this pre-UAP period. So we're going back to UFO reports. But I mean, you do have things like radar jamming, that was UAPs, I believe, along with reports of UFOs beginning nuclear launch sequences in Russia, disarming nuclear weapons in the United States, as you mentioned, a general interest in nuclear devices, I guess, nuclear silos. The carrier strike group, is that nuclear? I'm not sure, but
yeah, the carrier nuclear reactor, the carriers.
Yeah, and so these actions would be considered an act of war if the Russians or Chinese did it, right? Many of them, if not all. What are your thoughts on UAPs doing it?
Well, yeah, I mean, jamming, dangerous intercepts, operationally affecting nukes, whether it's shutting them down or causing them to a launch sequence, they'd all be considered hostile, aggressive, and highly unsafe if they were done by near-peer adversaries. And we see acts with jamming, painting targets of radars, and aggressive intercepts over the years, right? With from the Russians and the Chinese. So the intelligence behind UAP, as you and I discussed previously, and you pointed out, I mean, they'd know that humans are highly territorial, and anyone monitoring us would know that there are locations and periods of time where you have extremely high flashpoint tensions, around the world. So the Tehran case, there was jamming there. There was DI interest. Commander David Fravor reported jamming. So I'd say, those are all kind of hostile acts. And as a pilot or as the commander of a strike group, you'd have to see that as a hostile or aggressive act. If it were done by the Chinese, the Russians, it would definitely be a hostile or aggressive act.
Yeah. Now, I understand you also cataloged a list of medical problems in humans that were associated with UAP proximity, especially what appears to be radiation exposure to UAP drives. I'm wondering, can you tell me a little bit about what you found from sources in the UK Project Consign and Kit Green's research?
Yeah, what I learned was the various reports and experts and the incidents broadly concur. Paul Hill talking about the UFO field engine having radioactive properties and causing people to get sick with symptoms of radiation poisoning, talking about ultrasonic vibrations as a weapon. Kit Green with his doing one of the DIRDs, talking about the clinical, medical, acute and subacute field effects on human dermal and neurological tissues. Then Condine was talking about the close proximity of plasma-related fields can adversely affect a vehicle or a person. Radiated effects are reported. He talks about scorched human skin and damage to nearby terrestrial objects. He talks about these these emissions causing electronic and electrical systems to fail and causing humans and equipment to respond in unusual ways. And there's quite ominous. It talks about at worst close range exposure to UAP can cause some disturbing mental and physical effects. Then Sarfati also posits a connection between Skinwalker Ranch and sort of UFO weaponry. And he talks about the radiation there. He talks about Davis in the Rojas interview. He's talking about the Colares Brazil incident in 1977, where people were actually getting killed and injured. And he said the UOP were using beams to do it, and he goes, so UFOs have not been benevolent. They have not shown us space, brotherly love and peace type movements towards us. Puthoff has said you don't want to be near a UFO when it's powering up. Then you've got some famous cases, Falcon Lake in Manitoba in 1967. You've got the witness who was basically near a UAP when it was moving off, and so he gets that big kind of like a grill effect of a burn across his chest. You got the 1980 Cash Landrum incident where people got irradiated. You got the Jeremy Corbell interview around in the Uinta Basin with a mother and son, and you've got a witness who develops MS after an encounter. So yeah, there's a lot of I think UAP present they present a threat in terms of that they present risks associated with people's health.
Yeah. Well, and so one of the other things, and again, this is kind of taking a little bit of a step further out, but I wanted to ask about the stories of cattle mutilation and the abduction phenomena. Are these credible phenomena, or is the level of subjectivity too high for a useful analysis?
Okay, well, first of all, I'll just do a proviso. I'm not an expert in this field on cattle mutilations, but from what I've seen, there's simply too many cases, too many credible witnesses, whether it's ranchers, local law enforcement, they all know the land, they know the predators. You've got the specialized, kind of stock-related law enforcement who know about cattle. You've got, you've had FBI scrutiny, and the Black Vault have got a load of, released FBI files on those investigations. So they were taking it pretty seriously if they got the FBI involved. Although I haven't gone into those, reports, but they'd be, that's sort of on my to-do list. Talking to John Alexander, the precognitive sentient phenomena at Skinwalker Ranch, I mean, that's very, very compelling. And he talks about, that incident with a calf that occurred within 300 meters of a rancher, and he goes, the best explanation, even though it's inconceivable, was that the mutilation actually took place at another location, the body was returned. And then he says there's only two alternatives for that scenario: an invisible UFO or interdimensional interaction, and both exceed our understanding. And then he says, the PSP was completely in charge and also absolutely malicious. So then you have to ask, well, what could it do to humans who weigh less than cows if that intelligence wanted to? Quite interesting as well. I've been following David Paulides, of the missing 411 fame. He in one video was saying that he was very interested as well in the Skinwalker type events, principally because like his disappearances, they posited the same kind of like problem, like how did missing people get from A to B? How did bodies and articles of clothing get from A to B? And so that was very interesting. And then you're talking about the John Alexander talking about Skinwalker Ranch again. Obviously, I don't know if you've been watching the show Secrets of Skinwalker Ranch, but I mean, people have been irradiated there. One of the guys got hospitalized. Yeah, the ranch guy. So I mean, he was hospitalized. So I say there's a definite health risk there. In terms of abductions, I'd say they can be subjective in terms of who you talking to and who's doing the investigations and the regressions. But I think they're highly compelling in a number of cases. I've spoken to a number of abductees and experiencers, including sort of people close to me, and that's like I think where there lies the perception. Is one seeing it as malign or benign? And if you're seeing it as malign, then you'll call yourself an abductee because it's the physical act of being taken against your will. Whereas if it's a benign experience, then you're an experiencer because it's something that is beneficial. And then it's obviously up to the individual to decide whether their experience is benign or malign. But me personally, if I were taken away from my house without my permission, or moved through a solid object and then tested, had tests carried out on me, I would view that as a hostile act. If you look at abduction researcher David Jacobs, okay, so he's very much on the side of they are malign, it's there are aliens infiltrating society, people being abducted against their will, and he posits some quite horrific cases that happen, some quite horrific things that happen to people. But then again, if you look at Timothy Good's books, he talks about like some race that are living in Italy. They're kind of like a race of giants in his book, and they, not giants like massive giants, but giants as in like, kind of much bigger than normal people, but they have a very positive interaction with the people around them. So I don't know how valid that data is, but it's the malign versus benign, and you get different stories. Then you've got positive cases like the aerial sighting in Zimbabwe in 1994. I mean, the kids in the videos, if you look, they seem kind of freaked out, but not like terrified, freaked out, and they seem to be to be gaining a message from the occupants. So I cast that as a positive interaction. They weren't taken somewhere against their will. Harm didn't come to them. So yeah, I mean, you've got the whole malevolent versus benevolent. Is it abductions and infiltration and DNA extraction and manipulation, or is it sort of guiding humanity and saving us from ourselves? So I really, it's in some cases it's malevolent, and it all depends on who you talk to. But I'd say that when it comes to human safety, sometimes then you could say that they are unconcerned for human safety in certain cases. And I say they, well, who's they? That's the problem.
Well, and actually that was my next question, was based on what we've discussed so far. I was going to ask if you'd characterize the intent of these UAPs, and again, maybe even just using if the Navy is our baseline, if the Navy sightings are our baseline, but would you characterize the intent of these UAPs as malevolent or simply unconcerned for damage or harm that they might cause?
Well, they didn't. Are we talking specifically about the Nimitz case?
Well, I mean, the Nimitz case seems like that's kind of our baseline because that's been in the news, right? And so my thought was, if we baseline it there, that's a good place to start. And then I guess, any thoughts that you might have on the others. You've described a lot of malevolent behaviors, right, historically. And then the issue that we have is knowing how subjective those are, right? Like how much of ourselves we're putting into those events. So
I mean, I'll tell you, when I spoke to, Robert Salas, I spoke to him before I spoke to you, Captain Robert Salas of the 1967 Maelstrom UFO incident, when a week after a nearby silo had 10 missiles shot down, his own site had 10 missiles shot down, and he says, initially he viewed it as hostile, which you would maybe call malign, had hostile intent. He's sitting in his capsule underground. He's a launch control officer. The guys above, the Air Force security police guys are freaking out. They're firing weapons at the craft, so they clearly think that they're hostile. But he himself since then has said, well, they could have destroyed us if they wanted to, but they didn't. And they took our weapons offline, but the weapons were working again like the next day. So he initially saw them as hostile and as a threat, and then he didn't see them as hostile and a threat as time went on and he had more time to think about it. But if you talk about it from the Eric Davis point of view, as comes out in the paper, are they malevolent? Well, he says, it's like he says they've been hide and seek. We'll use stealth as far as possible, and he says that they've caused they have caused damage. They've caused ill effects to people. So in that case, I'd say they are malevolent. If we're talking specifically about the Nimitz case, I'd say no. I'd say it's concerning because they can operate with impunity. But I didn't really get the impression from any of the witnesses that they thought that it was like an imminent threat to them.
Yeah. Well, again, I think this is something you'd mentioned earlier. I just wanted to kind of drill down on this. Is it accurate then to say that UAP behavior is consistent with probing our defenses, our response time, our biology, and our weaknesses? Would that be accurate to say?
Well, yeah, I'd say very much so. I mean, if you look at the preceding statements, they use tactics, techniques, and procedures that we've used. Davis in the paper, he says they may be testing our technology, they may be testing the US Navy's capabilities. When they do this, they've also done it with the Air Force too, he says. So what are they doing it for? But then again, he says they're not human, they don't think like humans. So, but he underlies it, says, well, if they do decide to become aggressive, we're screwed.
Yeah.
I think in the Nimitz case as well, what the one disturbing thing was for me was about the cap point, about the tic tac appearing at the cap point. So that was quite disturbing, being able to that kind of like plugged into what the humans were actually doing.
What do you think that, I mean, based on this, do you think we've reached a point where we should be developing consistent, reliable, and accurate tools to identify and track UAPs at the very least?
Yeah, I think if you talk to, well, if you talk to someone like, Bob Maguire, who actually had in the paper, we've already got all those capabilities, and I think that, they're improving every day, and they've come a long, long way. But he mentioned the paper about, sensor fusion, the need to sort of bring all these together. That he talks about all the stovepiping and the fact that different agencies, different members of the intelligence community are very jealous of their capabilities and platforms. They don't like to share, so there's a need to like fuse that all. But I mean the capabilities and platforms are there to do it already. And if you read Alexander's book, when he visits NORAD, clearly, and also from my talk with Bob Salas, clearly these things have been popping up on radar and have been being detected for decades. So the sensors and the platforms are already there. The capabilities there. It's improving how all the different platforms and sensors work together.
Mm. What about our defenses? I mean, given the unknown intent and apparent technological capabilities of UAPs, should we be working on defenses specifically tailored to deter or eliminate these craft if required, if needed?
Yeah, I think you want to be very careful when you're going down that road, because they are so far advanced. I mean, you don't want to start a war with something that is so much more advanced than you, but at the same time, you have to be prepared to defend yourself. I'd say Davis certainly thinks so. All the way through the paper, he's talking about the defense intelligence, the DIRD reports about how the US needs to extrapolate, the physics and the engineering technologies, like to 2050 precisely, because of the need to be able to meet, tic-tac capabilities in case they decide to become a threat. So, that's already been decided in some quarters.
Now,
Sorry, I think the key question there, though, is whether there's the political will to actually carry that forward. Yeah, because obviously there's a lot of other, competing interests for resources and attention. The America's been involved in the war on terror for the past 2 decades. You still got the war on terror going on. They're not, it's not just Afghanistan, Iraq. It's like all over Africa, Asia, etc. You've got the near-peer adversaries like Russia and China, which have pulled ahead of the States in some respects, because the Americas basically allowed its conventional warfighting capability to lapse in a way, while it's been fighting the war on terror. And then so you've got a lot of spending to do there. You've got the rise of China. You've got to the improvements to be made to the U.S. Navy. So there's a lot of competing interests for resources, for personnel, for effort, for time. So if you're going to go down the route of developing tic-tac tech and tic-tac weapons to meet an extraterrestrial threat, which isn't arguably as immediately on the horizon as, say, Russia or China, then you're talking like a massive Manhattan-style project. If you talk to Sarfati, and he should know because one of his professors was involved in the original Manhattan project, you're talking a huge investment in people, resources, money to do that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, so now again, there are lots of conspiracy theories that involve the government on this, but when you set those aside, after reading your report, my takeaway was that the military has really suffered from some kind of analysis paralysis due to a lack of actionable insights into UAPs. I'm wondering, have we finally reached the point, or are we getting close to the point of having enough data to create national policy, military policy on this issue?
No, I don't think anybody outside of the UAPTF, probably other parts of the DoD and intelligence community, and potentially the Department of Energy, actually know. And if you're talking about deciding on policy, that requires political will. I think from what we know, open source, there's enough data to suggest that these phenomena are not from here, or they're not made by humans. So they can present a threat, clearly. They have been dangerous in the past, and they merit much closer attention and a strategy for threat mitigation, but that's going to be political will.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. I mean, I'm not sure how this ties in. This question is on my list, but we had mentioned the other day in discussion that we have SETI, we have Breakthrough Listen Project, we have a gold record on the Voyager probe. So mankind has been reaching out, right? That we are not not quiet. We are not silent. We've kind of got the front door open. And what we see with UAPs is, if this is in fact what it presents itself to be, despite all of the motions that we've made to reach out and contact intelligent species, intelligent civilizations in an open manner, like Eric said, they seem to be sneaking around the back door, I guess.
Yeah, sneaking around the back door, or overtly flying over the former Soviet Union and being chased by fighters. The fighters are crashing. Yeah, of course the Russians the Soviets would see them as a threat if they're causing launch sequences of intercontinental ballistic missiles. Of course they're going to be seen as a threat. So overt threat, and also the threat of the capabilities. What might they do in the future, and we don't understand their intent.
Yeah. Well, Frank, let me close by asking what comes next. The DNI has 180 days to publish a public report on the UAP phenomenon. What do you anticipate that they may do, and where do you see this issue going in the future?
Yeah, well, it's probably less than 180 days now. They're not going to talk about, in the unclassified report, they're not going to talk anything about sources, methods, capabilities, or platforms. Nothing that's going to help North Korea, China, Russia, Iran, and any other potential adversary. And they're probably not. They're going to have nothing embarrassing in there either, as in why they don't know what they don't know what they don't know, and why after 70 years there's still no kind of definitive answer. So I don't think you see anything on that either, because nobody wants to make themselves look bad. That's just human nature. I think it's going to depend on a lot of factors what we get. I mean, the juicy stuff will be in a classified report, but you've got a new administration. It will depend on the political will. You've got new civilian appointees at the Pentagon. You're going to have new civilian appointees like in the intelligence community at the top. You've got changes at the UAPTF. You've got funding issues. And as I said before, you've got a lot of other stuff going on in the world. It's a constant battle for resources, for people, for money, for time. As I said, the juicy stuff will be in a classified annex, but I doubt very much, I could be wrong, but I doubt very much that you're going to get craft or other technology or bodies being produced. I doubt that very, very much.
Wonderful. Well, Frank, thank you very much for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. It's been wonderful to be able to talk with you.
Thank you very much.